Good evening to all our listeners. You are listening to Lighthouse Radio, and we are back to our second segment titled Sa Mga Kwento Nila. Tonight, we will interview a migrant person who falls into a category called third culture kids or cross-cultural kids. Sa mga hindi alam ang term na ito, ang cross-cultural kid or third culture kid is a person who has lived in two or more cultural environments for a long period of time during their developmental years. And they are also children who were influenced both by their parents' culture and the culture in which they were raised. Let's delve more into this subject with our guest tonight, Mr. Daryl Bustos. Good evening, Daryl, and welcome to Lighthouse Radio. Before I start with my questions, I would like you to please give us a background about yourself, about your family. How long have you been here in Bahrain?
Hi, Noril. Thanks for having me. I am a Filipino that was born and raised here in Bahrain. Growing up in Bahrain has been amazing. I've been here for pretty much 30 plus years. My parents met here in Bahrain, and me and my other siblings, I have a brother and a sister, and we were all born and raised here in Bahrain.
Thank you, Daryl. So, for my first question, what are the things that you enjoy most living in a foreign country as a third culture kid?
I love the diversity. Here in Bahrain, it's a melting pot of ethnicities. It's common. For example, a lot of my peers are of different ethnicities, primarily Indians, Filipinos, Pakistanis, a couple from Western and Eastern Europe, and from different areas in the world. So it's really a melting pot of cultures and ethnicities.
So, it's the diversity that you really love
Yes.
about living in a foreign country. If you could give me three things that you didn't like growing up here in Bahrain as a TCK, just three things.
Um, well, technically, it's not things that I don't like, but it's just the how I felt so different growing up here in Bahrain. Because as a Filipino, we've had the language barrier of actually not learning Tagalog from a young age. So being able to communicate was an obstacle for us. And the other kids that came over here who weren't born and raised here, it was a different experience dealing with them. You were often looked at as different, and it was kind of strange for them that we didn't speak Tagalog. So that's one thing. Another thing is the Bahrainis that I grew around with, or the Arabs that I grew around with, would always ask me, "Why don't you know how to speak Arabic?" And that again, because Arabic isn't widely in a private school, Arabic at that in my time wasn't really widely taught. Another obstacle would be in terms of food. I would have different tastes in food. I I find Arabic food or Indian food much more appealing than Filipino food itself. So adjusting, even though my parents cooked Filipino food, it was an adjustment for me.
I see. Do you relate to this phrase? TCKs or CCKs are citizens of anywhere and nowhere. Why or why not?
Well, I do agree to that to a certain extent because we do feel like foreigners. We do feel like foreigners even in a place where we were born and raised. So to the people, we're foreigners to the people of the land we grew up in, and we're also foreigners to our own people or to our own to my fellow Filipinos as well. So but building upon that, home is really where the heart is. So as much as there is a struggle, you learn to embrace that identity.
I want to go back to the language barrier that you mentioned a while ago. I am not a TCK or a CCK, but it's important to me, this issue, because I am raising one. I am raising a daughter who was born and being raised here in Bahrain. And the first personal experience, a conflict that I faced was when I was filling up a form for my daughter, and it asked me, what is my daughter's mother tongue? And what is her second language? And for me, that is very conflicting because I know that my daughter's mother tongue is Filipino, but she doesn't really speak well Filipino, and she doesn't really understand. She's just learning. Her first language is English. Can you talk more about it? Your experience, your personal experience on it.
So growing up here as well, English is also my first language because it was the language that was commonly spoken amongst, because of multi ethnic groups that I've been in. English was the best way to communicate around with people. So if you're say I did struggle with learning Filipino because it's not only the language itself. It's easy to learn Filipino, Tagalog, all of that, but then the context from which it's coming from, like there are certain experiences with words, like for example the pronunciation that I pronounced wrongly because I didn't know it was supposed to be pronounced that way, or or given the context, it would be the way it's emphasized or the way you emphasize on it is in a totally different manner.
Right. And where do you feel most at home? Bahrain or Philippines, and why?
Home for me is like, as I was saying a while ago, home is where the heart is. So rather than thinking of it as a country or countries that I belong to, I know that I'm Filipino, but then at the same time I am a Bahraini at heart. So my attachments to any country, it's more of who are the group of people that I trust. So right now I relate more to being Filipino. So I would say that I am more inclined to the Filipino community. But then I do have nuances that is very local, that is very similar to Bahrain, to Arab culture, which I've also picked up. So it depends on the group of people that I'm with. So with Filipinos, I feel I try to adjust to be Filipino. With Bahrainis, I also have the nuances of being a Bahraini or that Arab. Even the way I speak is totally different when I speak around my Arab friends.
How do you manage this? I can see that it's like maybe it's a conflict. Would you recognize it as a identity crisis or a conflict, an internal conflict in yourself?
No, I don't see it as a conflict because I've learned to see you adapt and you learn to a certain extent. If there are certain nuances about a culture that you don't understand, then you kind of tiptoe around it and you find your footing around how you're going to deal with it. For example, with certain Filipino jokes that I totally don't understand, I try to not joke in that manner. Or, for example, if there's something in Bahraini culture that is funny in that way and I understand it, I try not to be too expressive. So it kind of limits my interaction verbally, but in terms of being friends, I've got close friends that are both Filipino and other cultures as well, and to me it's like I feel like a global person because I deal with multiple cultures and multiple multiple cultures and ethnicities.
So, I want to go to the part where you have to go back to the Philippines because my understanding is you went back to the Philippines to study for college. So, apart from your annual holidays, because overseas workers they do annual holidays to the Philippines once a year. So, the only time that you have to spend a substantial amount of time in the Philippines when you went to study for college back home. So, how was the experience about it, and what were your preparations during that time? Because I would assume that this is a very overwhelming part of your life.
Well, from the context of leaving Bahrain, going to the Philippines, when we were young, we were always trained by our parents that we are temporary migrant workers here in this country or in Bahrain. So we were always on our heels where, okay, anytime we'd be leaving. Though it would never happen. I guess we were kind of prepared, but then at the same time, we never saw it coming as when it came, it was least expected. So in terms of preparation, I think mentally we knew it was coming, or we knew we had to leave or go back to study at a certain point in time. But culturally, it was more of culture shock. Going back to the Philippines, I love the Philippines. It's an amazing, it was an amazing experience to study in the Philippines, but it is so different from Bahrain. The level of trust that I have in people, for example, like because there are not a lot of Filipinos in Bahrain, or there are not a lot of Filipinos everywhere I go. Um, I was under the impression that, you know, those of the same communities, they would stick closer together. So I would look at every Filipino in the Philippines as my brethren. You know, in a way, I'm like, okay, we're all Filipino. We're all here for each other. And it turns out that, you know, when it comes to hustling, that's not really the case. So that was a struggle in preparation. Mentally, we were prepared, but it's really hard to prepare for culture shock.
What were the what are the two things in the Philippines you identify to, and what are the things you feel you are so different from?
Funny enough, when I was in the Philippines, where I studied, there was a group of expatriates, the people that I actually related to in the Philippines were not mostly Filipino. There were Filipinos that were also, you know, Filipinos that grew up in the Middle East, not necessarily Bahrain. They were, you know, from other Arab countries or Filipino Americans. That was a niche that I kind of got into, or that I got along with. And then also other ethnicities like Koreans, Chinese, because the idea was this Philippines, when we went there, it was foreign to us, or being Filipino was very foreign, even though if we went there every, we often visited. That's where I'm coming from.
If you would have given a chance, what would have you done differently for you to cope better during your reintegration in the Philippines? Like, your reintegration is when you went there for school.
Um, I guess the idea is, for me, I believe that you can't always simulate what is in the Philippines what is it. You can't simulate the Filipino community that's in the Philippines. It's always unique. But the best thing, I guess, would be the values, and that really, the family values, the cultural values that were instilled in us by my parents, by my community. Those are things that really kept me safe and really kept me grounded to a certain extent. So I would say more emphasis on that. Like there has to be integration between what a person would like to experience, and also, there has to be a way where the morals and values that you teach at home is related to the culture that you're going to be interfacing with.
If there is a TCK or CCK listening somewhere in this world, and he or she struggling somehow, to integrate, to be understood, to find her identity, what would you tell her or him?
I would tell another third culture kid that it's okay. Being different is a great thing, and you have to find your balance, and you have to find sync you have to find sync within yourself and within the culture that's interfacing you. It has to be, you have to consider that this is me, this is my personality, this is the culture that I grew up with, and regardless of what other people say or how different they perceive me, I am I am, I do not feel limited by that. That's what I would tell them. Like, be confident, be who you are, and just love is a universal language. It's as long, the more you care, it people would understand what you're all about.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for sharing your truth with us. Really an honor to be with you here tonight. Before we end, I just want to share that I have been an overseas worker for 16 years. I have met different migrants from different walks of life, and their narratives are fascinating, moving, and scary all at the same time. I've always felt that it must be heard, retold, or recorded somehow to be accessed by others to pass on the lessons from their stories of success and heartaches. I hope this pilot episode serves its purpose. You will hear more migrant stories after this short break.
Thank you.